is, who are you going to have that conversation with, that honest conversation with? It might be your leader, whoever that is. It might be a spiritual director. It might be a close and trusted friend. If you've got somebody who has a coaching kind of relationship with you, then it might be something to have with that. That might be a good place to have that conversation. But where are you going to just have that conversation around? I just notice that this is holding me back. And it's nothing to do with money, and it's not really anything to do with buildings. Actually, if I'm really honest, if I was given all of that on a plate, there would still be this small part of me that would hold back. And let's explore that at the feet of Jesus and allow him to bring hope and courage back to us. Dave, I'm going to hand over to you for the more practical stuff.
Thanks, Claire. So I'm Dave Champness. You've probably heard from me by email. So I've been part of the team, privileged to bring this about, and it is a delight to see so many folk here. Who am I? I live in Leyland in Lancashire, post-industrial town. I'm a church warden of a church plant onto an estate that was where the church building was actually built in 1968, and it still has a presence there. And that's kind of because of people's thinking about where do they want to plant 50, 60 years ago, and some plants are still going strong. I also work for the Estates Evangelism Task Group for a couple of days a week, working with Bishop Lynn and others. That's right. And also work for one day a week in the Diocese of Blackburn, looking after a couple of SDF projects that I'm really excited about. One of which is called Outer Estates Leadership, which does what it says on the tin. And it's great to have some folk who have been through the Empower lay leadership development. Go team Empower. It's also great to see Heather here from the Diocese of York, who've also done something around lay leadership development. And I think Tim Ling has got some copies of a report that was done and released at Synod, General Synod in February of this year, talking about some of those lay leadership development courses that have happened in 4 dioceses, and our desire is to see more of them. So if your diocese isn't doing anything at the moment, please do take one of those and have a read, and perhaps kind of encourage perhaps through the estates focal lead that we mentioned about, perhaps sort of saying, could we have something like this in our diocese? So that's what I do for my day job, as I say. What I'd like to just talk a little bit around is A, the Estates Management Task Group, and B, some of those kind of institutional things that may be kind of getting in the way. I am no expert in all of these things. I'm going to give you kind of an example of how we might be able to try and get around it, but I'm looking here around, and you've probably worked your way around some of the diocesan structures and know your way to kind of get some of this stuff done. And if you have done, that'd be great. And if you could feed that through to Andre at some point, because I'd love to hear more stories as to how we can kind of get things happening for estates. So Estates Evangelism Task Group came out of the wider Evangelism Task Group that the Archbishop set up in the middle of the last decade. And Bishop Philip North, Bishop of Burnley, now Bishop of Blackburn, said this is all great, but all what you're talking here isn't going to resonate on the margins. I want to set up a separate group that focusing on estates evangelism. And he did that and led that. And I'm here to tell you that actually the Church of England has, in 2019, said it wants to see a loving, serving, worshipping Christian community on every significant social housing estate in the country. General Synod voted unanimously for that. So if anyone says, there's nothing, why should we do anything about estates? Well, you can remind them of that. And then if your bishop actually kind of goes, well, I'm not really bothered about estates, can you remind him or her about their ordination service, in which, I quote, they are to have a special care for the poor, the outcast, and those who are in need. And then they are blessed and said, May God anoint and empower you to bring good news to the poor. So there should be no bishop anywhere in this Church of England who doesn't support what we're about. Now, they might just need that gentle reminding of that wonderful service when they got all their finery, that's what they were blessed with. So, something to think through. Next slide, please. Now, there you will see a picture of Mark Powley doing the Iron Man, looking at what are some of the practical church planting hurdles do we face or have you faced? Now, Claire was talking about some of those external factors. Would you like to kind of shout out some of those that you've kind of come across when you were discussing that? Any thoughts? You know, what kind of gets in the way? Finance. Lack of understanding. What, from senior clergy? Mm-hmm. Parochialism. Do you want to unpack that a little bit in terms of?
My parish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just like added with that, navigating any process in that. So what is the process for having those conversations is often unclear, and everyone's just making up as they go along.
Mm-hmm. Processes are unclear of how to move things along.
Lack of support in the long run, like people get on board with it initially and then persevering to see something kind of sometimes feels like people when they're all up for it when they go there.
Yeah.
They expect you just to crack on.
So it's long-term perseverance and supporting people.
Success criteria.
Mm-hmm. Would that be something to do with an SDF?
Moving the goalposts, even from funders.
Mm-hmm. Moving the goalposts. There's some over there. Andy?
Not being given or allowed to have team and also having preset ideas about what church actually means.
Mm-hmm. And Kevin?
Lack of understanding that it takes more than 5 years to plan to self-sustain church.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
No funding models that ever get that close.
So I'm going to not necessarily be able to answer all of them. I don't have the silver bullet. Sorry, one last.
People and capacity, very often there's a few people at absolute capacity, very good opportunity, but not people don't realise it.
Mm-hmm. And one final one.
Related to finance, but building repairs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Building repairs related to finance. So I'm going to pick on a few, some of which have been brought up and some haven't. Just to kind of think through where we might be able to kind of get some support. So the first one is, if you can flick on, is paperwork and filling in forms and all that type of stuff. And the feedback I've had from some places is that admin is one of those things that kills mission quite easily, especially in estate plants can be a tricky thing to do, and finding people who are willing to serve, doing things like PCC secretary and all that kind of stuff. If you could just flick the next one on. So again, no particular silver bullet, but one thing to think about and to perhaps ask about at deanery level, perhaps at diocesan level, is are there any churches who are willing to twin with us? And as an example, in Blackpool, and Linda's here when she was in Blackpool, that twinned with another parish that was sort of in a more rural setting, and they learned a lot from each other. And it wasn't just a one-way street. Linda took the community choir out to the Chipping in the village, and Chipping brought people who were kind of giving some advice and some support to her and the team in terms of the local setup. So something to look at in terms of asking, are there churches in this deanery who would be willing to perhaps lend us someone who might be able to be the PCC secretary or to be a treasurer or something like that? Don't be afraid to ask. People can say no, but then always ask again, and we just remind them what we're about here is about sustaining and increasing mission in urban and in estates. Next slide, please. Finance. Strategic development funding has been a blessing, but it does come with some challenges in terms of targets. I think most of the people who are the consultants who operate out of the vision and strategy team in London are very much behind wanting to see investment in urban and estate communities, because we go back to the fact that that's what General Synod said. There is lowest income community funding that is around. This is me personally saying, I don't think it's enough. I think it should be doubled, because I'd love to see at least all of the parishes in the bottom 20% for income deprivation having the support for at least some stipendiary ministry, if supported by their lay teams. That's what I'd love to be able to see. We're not there yet, but that's something, again, on behalf of the Estates Evangelism Task Group, we're kind of looking at wanting to sort of encourage the National Church much more towards. But those consultants are there for you. It's just a question of how do you get to those people through the diocesan structures, and that's where these estate focal leads, they should know, but if they don't, I point them in my direction. I'm very, very happy to help. And perhaps at a more local level, one of the questions, again, coming back to finances and how to sort of manage them, if I can't find anyone to be a treasurer, is that Bishop Lynn and I have been speaking to the people at ACAT. If you can just flick on the next slide, the Association of Christian Accountants and Treasurers. And they are really up for supporting ministry in income-deprived areas. And they are offering their basics course for people who you might see in your congregation, your team, who the thought of being a treasurer, that's really, really frightening. But actually, if they kind of go through the basics, they can kind of see what it might entail. But equally, they can find people who will be willing to provide the sort of things that we have to go through, like independent examiners and that type of stuff. So look out for information about that. Okay, next slide, please. Buildings. Hey, so Kevin and Rebecca recognise that. That's over Darwin at St James, a Grade 2 listed building on the outskirts of Blackburn. It looks nice on the outside. I haven't put the internal photograph. On the inside, the sacristy, you can't get behind the curtain, and it's not any sort of religious curtain. It's a curtain to stop stuff dropping off from the dry rot. Now, that church is on the edge of an estate and it's been there for hundreds of years. It is, with Kevin, who's an urban evangelist, working in the area, making lots of contacts, currently operating out of some shops on the estate, which is great because it's kind of a presence bang in the middle of the estate, but it isn't the long-term solution. We'd love to be able to bring about the internal refurbishment of it. And we're going through the process now in terms of where do we find £1 million or £2 million to bring that refurbishment about. But we're asking the questions of people, in taking advice from the diocesan structures, the diocesan buildings advisor, but also exploring some of those grants that might be available. If you could just flick on, Andy, please. So the next one as well. So there are helpful hints on the National Church website where there might be funders. But buildings, I think, is one of those interesting challenges. If we're blessed with a building like that, where do we find money to kind of keep going? But if we don't have to operate out of an existing church building, are there other opportunities? Sharon, who's here, operates out of a local library and has done as part of her plant for the last 4 or 5 years, really successfully, and has got an allotment and has got a kind of bringing in the environmental stuff alongside all the other kind of work that she's doing with the community there. There was talk about schools. There are 500 C of E foundation schools located on social housing estates in this country. There are another 400 that are located in parishes in the bottom 20% for income deprivation. Now, that is one of the legacies of the development of kind of religious education as it was in the 20th century and earlier that we can benefit from. Most of the heads of those schools are Christians. That's an opportunity to kind of knock on the door. And as was mentioned before, the Church of England has got a target to sort of increase the number of grow younger and more diverse, and as part of that, it would love to see more worshipping communities based in schools. Wouldn't it be great if many of them could be on our estates? And again, that's about a question of asking, because the national church, once it sort of moves on from talking about sex in LLF, Archbishop's Council are going to focus heavily on younger and more diverse. So that's where, when they start to talk about things, money starts to come. So there's going to be opportunities flowing to think about that. And the Growing Faith Foundation that Lucy Moore's involved with, which is around that kind of the community, sort of the worshipping community, the school and the household, again, very much kind of, they're open for us to come up with ideas and say, we'd love to be able to try this in this estate or this income deprived community. So feel empowered to go and do that. Next slide, please. Relationships. Now, some of the things we talked about already, it's not easy working in some areas where there are issues of mental health, there are issues that we're dealing with in terms of the people in our community and relationships, and not all of the relationships are going to be healthy ones. There may well be areas where people are in conflict with each other. Either that's in the church community or in the wider community, and so where can we help? If you flick on, Andy, please. And there is something called the Archbishop of Canterbury's Reconciliation Project, and they've come up with a course called the Difference Course. And again, they're really keen to see this course trialled and used in estate contexts. They love it to try it and to adjust it so that it kind of has some benefit in that way. And then staying safe. Sometimes people might be part of the kind of that internal question, do I want to move on to an estate? Will my family be safe? And that is a legitimate thing for people to be concerned about. And again, that's where the diocesan teams are there to provide that support. And if you could flick on, have all of the security stuff, demand it. If it's not coming, say, I want to be safe and I need to be safe so that I can continue to be God's presence in this community. And then the last one, I didn't have a silver bullet at all. These were just some pointers, but we're not doing it in our own strength. It's amazing what God does when we pray. And I think it's continuing to spend time praying, and I've just seen so many things happen where you kind of, how did that ever going to occur? But it has, because of good and faithful prayer. And I know that you know that, but it's always, when it comes down to sort of some of these practical things, how do we make that occur? And I do believe in that power of prayer. So that's where I'm going to end. Slightly earlier ahead of time. I'm sure no one's going to say, no, Dave, carry on for another half an hour. So can I just pray for us? Lord God, I just thank you for all the people here. Thank you for their commitment and their love of you. We thank you for all of the communities that are represented here. We know that you have a heart for those who are on the margins. You were there on the margins. And Lord, just to pray that you will help us to continue to be good and faithful servants, help us to work through those practical issues, and help us to, and pray that you will unlock doors that are currently locked that are preventing more planting of churches and worshipping communities in the margins of this country. Amen.
Thanks, Dave. And can we just say a big thank you to Dave, actually, because Dave, you've done so much work to make this happen. And yeah. The problem when you put like ideas people together is that they create loads of stuff, and you need somebody who's got a handle on the admin to bring it into reality. And that's absolutely with Chris and I. Thanks, Dave.